Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and you're listening to the Film Stories podcast. Now, in some exciting news, I've got a new boss for a little bit. Tom Cruise is in charge today, and I'm not allowed to start until he says now.
I am the one who's in charge. I am the one who says yes, no, now.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Oh, huge thanks to Tom Cruise there. Hello and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. I am Simon Brew. That's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, as the title suggests, is to tell the stories of films. And I tend to talk about development stories, marketing stories, production stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films that I tend to cover, well, they're films I tend to be interested in or invested in to some degree. I try really hard not to do snark. I try not to punch down. I'm just celebrating films, really, the fact that they get made and the people that make them. Without further ado, I'm going to start with the first of the two movies I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. We're going back to 1999, to a real personal favourite of mine. I'm just going to play you a little bit of music from the film. I'll come to the story the other side of this.
When you first began it, you got what you want. Now you can hardly stand it though. By now you know it's not going to stop. It's not going to stop. It's not going to stop till you wise up.
That then was a clip, well, a song from 1999's Magnolia, sung by Amy Mann and the cast, that particular song, directed and written by Paul Thomas Anderson, starring, deep breath, Jeremy Blackman, Tom Cruise, Melinda Dillon, Philip Baker Hall, Philip Seymour Hoffman, Ricky Jay, William H. Macy, Alfred Molina, Julianne Moore, Michael Murphy, John C. Reilly, Jason Robards, Melora Walters. That's just the tip of the iceberg of the ensemble for this one. And it's no surprise that Paul Thomas Anderson is a filmmaker influenced by the late great Robert Altman and his long interlocking films such as Nashville and Shortcuts. But the story of Magnolia itself started in earnest in post-production on the film Boogie Nights, which had come out in 1997, and it would be fair to say was a film that both ignited Paul Thomas Anderson's career after the disappointing release of the hugely underrated Sydney, which was rebranded as Hard 8 for its release and not pushed particularly well. Boogie Nights was a critical and small commercial hit, and it is a film I keep promising to come back to, and I will at some point. It got Oscar acclaim. Infamously, Burt Reynolds got a Best Supporting Actor Oscar nomination for it after describing the fact that he wasn't that keen on the film. But also, it was really, really useful for New Line Cinema at this point as well. An independent production company that was growing in stature. And in fact, in 1999, it had a huge hit with Austin Powers' The Spy Who Shagged Me. But primarily, it was the house that the Nightmare on Elm Street series had built. Yet, off the back of Boogie Nights, Nights. Here was now this independent where you were able to get daring, sprawling, long-running movies through the Hollywood system and also, crucially, turn them into successes. Now, New Line has since been absorbed by the Warner Brothers empire and isn't quite what it once was. But at this stage, towards the end of the 1990s, at a point where a whole bunch of interesting independent filmmakers were coming through, New Line found itself in a strong position. So it had a relationship with Paul Thomas Anderson, who'd suddenly become to one of Hollywood's most in-demand directors. Just to give some flavour of the idea that the impact it was having in the Hollywood community, off the back of Boogie Nights, Warren Beatty called Paul Thomas Anderson up, then in his late 20s, Paul Thomas Anderson, not Warren Beatty, to ask him for lunch. Steven Spielberg had given him a call to ask about the long opening tracking shot in Boogie Nights. When Anderson went to have his lunch with Warren Beatty, Francis Ford Coppola came over while they were having their dinner and explained to Anderson that this was his moment of power, that this film, now that he was on everybody's radar and they all wanted him, this was the moment to do a really daring film, the thing that he wouldn't be able to do at any other point. Now, off the back of Boogie Nights, Anderson had been toying with doing something a bit smaller and a bit more intimate, but it gradually started to grow in his head. And I mean, at this point, his father had died just ahead of the release of Boogie Nights, and he'd been fashioning he'd got lots of family stories and memories that he wanted to fashion into a film. And it was during the post-production of Boogie Nights that he started putting things down on paper and started weaving some narratives. And there was that tip of the hat to Robert Altman as the number of characters gradually grew in the film. Now, one other person who was hugely impressed with Boogie Nights was Tom Cruise, because he was shooting the film Eyes Wide Shut in the UK for Stanley Kubrick. That shoot went on for around the best part of 2 years, and Kubrick screened the movie. Whilst he was making that film, Tom Cruise saw it and got in touch with Anderson and said that he wanted to work with him. Now, already by this stage, Anderson was working. He was getting things down on paper for what Magnolia would become. But when it became clear that Cruise was absolutely serious about wanting to do something, he started writing a role for him in the film, a character by the name of Frank T.J. Mackey. If you have seen the film, that character needs no introduction whatsoever. It would be fair to say it is the kind of role that people say Tom Cruise doesn't play anymore, for the primary reason that it's the kind of role that Tom Cruise doesn't play anymore. Now, it would take 8 months after that Tom Cruise meeting to get a script to a place that Anderson was happy with. In fact, to fine-tune the end of at the end of the script. And I'm grateful for the book Paul Thomas Anderson Masterworks, which I've dug into. It was one of a few books I've dug into for this. He was lent a cabin by William H. Macy in Vermont, so he could go there for the last 2 weeks just to lock down, spend some intense writing time to get the script finished. But he had trump cards here. Anderson was wanted, New Line wanted to make another film with him, and he'd managed to lure Tom Cruise to the project as well. And I mean, New Line had already basically committed, although not signed a check, to doing whatever Anderson was going to do. Told the filmmaker, want to do whatever you're up to. And so, I mean, it probably helped at the time that was the point where Anderson was talking about doing something a little bit smaller, but Magnolia was getting bigger. Yet that chip in the back pocket of having Tom Cruise wanting to be involved, well, that swung things in his favour still further. And Anderson at this point was still in his late 20s. He was full of creative energy, and a 190-page screenplay was the end result of his work on writing Magnolia. But not only did New Line say they wanted to make a film with him, they gave him a really incredible deal for it as well, because they agreed to give him, if he made the film with them, final cut on the movie, complete creative control over Magnolia. And as he explained to Sharon Waxman in her excellent book, Rebels on the Backlot, he knew what Coppola was saying, and he knew in his heart this was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to do a film like this with complete creative control. And he told Waxman, I consider Magnolia a kind of beautiful accident. It gets me. I put my heart, every embarrassing thing that I wanted to say, in Magnolia. So Over at New Line, an executive by the name of Mike DeLuca, who was a friend and real supporter of Paul Thomas Anderson, took delivery of the final script. And this was the point where New Line confirmed for definite that it was going to back the film, even in the face of Anderson saying this was going to be 3 hours long. But the Tom Cruise factor again was playing a part. And whilst New Line in its heart of hearts knew this wasn't the kind of film that was likely to make money, they also knew it could serve as a talent magnet of sort. It would add prestige to the company. Plus, it's a film they actually wanted to make. They had conditions to the point where they approved the budget of it. It was going to be 3 hours tops. It had to have Tom Cruise in it. And also, from Anderson's point of view, he would get the creative control that he wanted. And Cruise duly signed up. I mean, everything was announced and came together in October of 1998, under a year ahead of the film's release. And the film's budget spiked inevitably as soon as one of the biggest movie stars in the world committed to taking part in the film. So Cruise agreed a deal whereby he was paid $7 million for his work in Magnolia. Now, his usual asking price at this point was $15 to $20 million, but this was going to be a supporting role, and it came with certain conditions. The primary one being he couldn't be used as the focal point of the promotional campaign. This could not be sold as a Tom Cruise film. I mean, Cruise had some nerves about the character of Frank T.J. Mackey anyway, and this isn't necessarily the kind of film that he wanted to go out to his traditional fan base. New Line agreed. That initially knocked the budget up. Now, the initial budget of this was said to be in the region of $10 million, and Cruise's salary alone would have put that up to $17 million. But as soon as you've got a movie star on board and all the other bits and bobs that are being drawn to it, plus the script was getting bigger and the ambition of it was getting bigger, well, $35 million was set aside by New Line for the film. Now, for the rest of the cast, Anderson actually went with many of his Boogie Nights and Hard Eight ensemble. And so that long cast list that I read you at the start, most of them he'd worked with somewhere along the line before. Now, Jason Robards was an exception. Robards, an Oscar-winning actor, held in high prestige, was coming to the end of his 70s at this point, and he'd been seriously ill. That he'd been suffering from lung cancer, and then he'd had an infection to the point where it was touch and go whether he was actually going to recover. Now, in the interim, there was a role written of Earl Partridge in the film, and I don't want to give spoilers away. That role, when Robards initially had to turn it down, was offered to George C. Scott, and George C. Scott turned it down, at which point it came back to Robards, who was in a slightly better position to do the film. Now, Robards had concerns, but then it was Alfred Molina, I think he put in a call to him, and Molina explained that Paul Thomas Anderson loves actors, and basically, by the sounds of it, Robards would lie in bed for the bulk of the film and just be revered, which is pretty much what happened. Robards' daughter and wife both read it as well, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say that the character of Earl Partridge is dying for most of the film. And they read it, and it just really struck home given the circumstances that Robards was going through at that point. And Robards agreed. He signed on the dotted line, not knowing that this would ultimately end up being his final film. So the cast had come together, the crew had come together, and there was this absolutely determined, self-assured writer-director at the heart of the film. And Brian Raftery's excellent book, Best Movie Year Ever, also talks about Magnolia, and just how incredible it was a film like this could get the green light in Hollywood. So with a 79-day shoot planned for the film, Paul Thomas Anderson went back to his stomping ground at San Fernando Valley to start filming in January of 1999. And there are a few bits and bobs he really wanted to do with this. So first of all, while he'd been writing the film, he'd been listening to the music of Amy Mann. I played you a bit of her music at the start of this segment. And he started weaving her work and her lyrics and her songs into the fabric of the film. There's a music video that Amy Mann recorded as well, that she came in, and Anderson directed the music video, and she came in and filmed certain bits as the film was shooting. I mean, one of the things with Magnolia is when the original DVD came out, there is an excellent behind the scenes making of on it. It's really terrific, one of the best I've seen on disc, and it goes into all of that. And Anderson was so influenced by Amy Mann, he would describe it in the end, the film, as for all intents and purposes an adaptation of her songs. So that song Wise Up that I played, for instance, that wasn't actually originally written for Magnolia. That was written for Cameron Crowe's film Jerry Maguire, also coincidentally starring Tom Cruise. Now, it didn't make the final cut of Jerry Maguire, but Anderson had heard heard that song deep into the writing of the screenplay, and he reworked sections of it around that song, including what you could call a very famous Greek chorus-esque moment in the movie where the cast stopped to sing the song. Now, at the point this was presented to the cast, it would be fair to say some of them were really a little bit unsure of it. This was a very out there moment in an already ambitious film, with, let's just say, another very out there moment to come not too long afterwards. The way Anderson went round this was he got Julianne Moore on board first, got her to record her vocals for it, and once she was in place and her work was in place, the rest of the cast just relaxed a little bit more into it. Now, for Tom Cruise, he'd done some preparatory work already with Paul Thomas Anderson for the role of Frank Mackey in the movie, and Anderson had been influenced originally by conversations he'd overheard when he was younger, and a recording of a conversation he'd heard when he was younger. And as soon as he dug into that a little bit more, he found that there were, and again, I'm going very spoiler-like, characters like Mackey who were selling their services to men about how to assert themselves in certain ways. So Cruise came in for the actual physical production. He had a 3-week window in which to shoot his scenes, and it would be fair to say he fully committed to the role. And it's quite interesting that Anderson, if anything, directed him to pull things back a little bit in his portrayal of Mackey, that there are particularly tender moments in the film where he quietened Cruise down. Not that he was going absolutely manic or anything, but Cruise kept bringing ideas to the character as well. I mean, there was at one point the idea of using a prop whip in the film. It's not that kind of movie. That idea was, for instance, discarded as they shaped the character between them. There was a $5 million of the budget that was set aside for amphibians. I think I can safely say that. And the production began to overrun. Now, there was talk that Anderson wasn't the easiest person to work with on this film. I mean, he's done some retrospective interviews about it that I find quite interesting. I get no sense that it was horrible in a nasty old Hollywood kind of way, that a young man with a degree of arrogance about what he knew he wanted to do, and to be fair, was able to get with the movie. Very in awe of actors, but nonetheless, he was running through brick walls to get his film. And so it gradually overran. In fact, the movie is a production overran by nearly 2 weeks in the end, and the budget ballooned too. It was up to about 42 million by the time production wrapped up. And all of a sudden, this wasn't a small independent film anymore. It had got bigger and bigger and bigger. And you going back to that making of on the Magnolia disc, you kind of see how frazzled and intense Anderson was getting with it. And at certain points, quite jocular and almost gallows humoury about just how long the film is going to be. They trade bets with the cast at one point because they were conscious that this was not going to be on the short side. In fact, Bob Shaye, who was one of the people heading up New Line Cinema at this point, towards the end of filming on Magnolia, did bump into Paul Thomas Anderson and asked him, and this is a tale that's recounted in Rebels on the Backlot, he asked him how the film was coming along, and Anderson was like, yep, good. Shaye then asked him how long it was, and Anderson replied 3 hours and 20 minutes. So Shaye was a bit aghast at this and just said to Anderson that, it's got to come down. And Anderson replied to him, Bob, I have 2 words for you, final cut. And he walked away. And the book describes how Shaye was seething at this, and he just said, I hate that kind of arrogance, saying that you're the banker, you'll get what I give you. I don't think it's the studio's obligation just to support people. If you want a patron, go to Medici Films down the street, a company I'm not familiar with, but nonetheless, the point being that even though Anderson had contractually He had contractual rights to a film of whatever length he wanted. New Line, I think, was looking, and I'll come to this again shortly, for a little bit more back and forth from him. New Line was not going to get it. Filming wrapped up in the end in June of 1999, and Anderson went into post-production on the film, and there was no way it was not going to be long. But also Anderson was very, very involved in the creative and the promotion of the movie, and he had certain rights there as well, because the film was not going to be test screened. He got that into his contract that it didn't have to happen. So he did a couple of screenings in the end, but not traditional test screenings. So one of them was for Tom Cruise. Now, Cruise had gone on to film, he'd gone over to Australia to film Mission Impossible 2 at this point, and so Anderson took the film to him so that he could see it. He did one audience screening with specially invited audience, but he didn't give them cards or anything like that. He just wanted to be in a room to see how he played, how the film played with an audience. And it was off the back of that he chopped 10 minutes out of the film. However, it was still a very long film. In fact, the final cut of the movie comes in at 188 minutes, so more than what New Line's original mandate as well. But then New Line liked the footage that it was seeing. It was just nervous at the size of it, and also it was nervous that it knew that this was going to be really quite a tough sell. Now, Anderson had assumed that the bit that was going to be the hardest to sell was the Tom Cruise material in the film. He was expecting some pushback on that. He didn't actually get it. But he originally had delivered a 3 hour and 18 minute final cut before that test screening. That wasn't a test screening. And it was New Line had asked him to cut that down even at that point. And he just said no. And he said it's too long. And he said in hindsight, it was too long, but I was in the middle of it. I couldn't figure out how to take it out. We were rushing. It was too fast. If I had 3 or 4 more months, I could have done it, and then added, that's not an apology for it. And in fact, I went to a Q&A after a screening of the film, I think it was Inherent Vice, with Anderson, and he talked about Magnolia, and he's done this in a couple of interviews about how he would cut it down now, that he would rein his ego in a little bit. I think that was his words at the Q&A, and he would just pull the film back. And in fact, it was the Greek chorus moment that at the Q&A I sat through where he just said he wouldn't put that in now. Now, I for one would say I'm really, really glad he did put that in, but also he added in a Reddit Q&A session as well that he would chill the clock out and cut 20 minutes out of the film now. Nonetheless, even with the problems and the dissatisfaction over the length of the movie, New Line did sense Academy Award interest here, and the Tom Cruise factor was a thing as well. But it was a thing that became complicated when Tom Cruise, and this isn't a podcast that goes tabloidy, I just put this as a fact that was out there that was affecting the release of the film. His marriage, was it to Nicole Kidman, was ending at this point, and so he'd just come off the press tour for Eyes Wide Shut, and there'd been loads and loads of questions then. There were going to be even more now, and so Cruise's representatives pulled back on just how much press contact he was going to have for the film. Now, they already couldn't put out a poster or anything with his name brightly on it. He had to be sold as part of the ensemble. And in fact, in the UK, because the poster for Magnolia was, as was the trailer in the end, all approved by Anderson. He put them together. He was given studio cut trailer, couldn't stand it, and so did his own. The poster, much to the unhappiness of New Line, was it was the Magnolia flower poster, and that it didn't make anything really of the human beings in it, and the studio wasn't best pleased with that. But again, he had the rights to do all of this. When it was released in the UK, just jumping ahead a little bit, it was a different distributor, entertainment film distributor over here, that was quite notable for the way it let's just say it put its posters together at this point. And by the time we got a release of the movie in the UK, the film had an Oscar nomination for Tom Cruise. And so what entertainment did over here is they just put starring Oscar nominee Tom Cruise in very, very, very big letters on it, which was their way of getting round it. So the trailer itself that I just talked about there, even that wouldn't arrive until just a few weeks before the release of the film. And New Line had decided to give this a limited release on December the 17th, 1999, to qualify it for Academy Award contention ahead of a wide release on January the 7th, 2000. But the problem was, with all of the promotion of the film, how on earth do you explain Magnolia? How can you put this across in the way an audience really would get? You know, not even reducing it down to one line. Just how can you talk about it? And I found an archive interview on the Manufacturing Intellect YouTube channel where Anderson himself was asked that very question. And this goes to the root of the issue they had trying to sell the film. Here is that little snippet of Anderson from a press junket.
What's this movie about?
None of us could figure it out, you know, and it wasn't like someone could figure it out and someone else didn't agree with it. It was really just well, it's too hard to describe, so let's just say here's who's in it, these are the characters, and, you know, I mean, I could probably go on forever about what it's about, but...
And it was a very long but that was left at that point. And just for context, that wasn't an interview like 10 years after for a DVD release or something like that. That was an interview that was put out at the time of the film's release. The film then, I mean, it was released and it went before critics, and to call it divisive would be no understatement at all. It was and is a hugely, hugely daring, ambitious film. The kind of film, going back to what Francis Ford Coppola said, that you can only make potentially in that moment. And I mean, people who loved it absolutely adored it. People who didn't, well, let's just say they were complete. I mean, it wasn't quite a Marmite movie, but it wasn't far off. In fact, I remember going to see it with my brother when it came out. I walked out thinking it's one of the best things I'd seen on a cinema screen, and he fell asleep saying it was terrible. And I don't actually think that's a bad distillation of how people responded to the film. But even there are instances of a couple of people who absolutely loved the film, but let's just say it's got two massive turns in it, I would suggest, and those were the bits that lost even some of the people who were utterly on its side. And so this very difficult to promote film, where its one huge movie star was reluctant to do press, and where the marketing campaign couldn't explain the movie at all, inevitably struggled. And whilst it opened with interest, I mean, it's opened in 7 screens to qualify for the Academy Awards, and its per screen average was something like $27,000, a huge amount really as a screen average. By the time it came to a wider release, well, it was clear that this was not going to be a massive hit. So the movie on its wide release it moved over to 1,000 screens, and it was 7th place. It's the best it did. 7th place at the US box office that weekend with 5.6 million. And it was up against films like Stuart Little that had hung around, The Green Mile, The Talented Mr. Ripley, Any Given Sunday, Galaxy Quest, Toy Story 2, all much easier films to sell than this one. Just below it in the chart that weekend with Bicentennial Man, Deuce Bigalow, Male Gigolo, and Snow Falling on Cedars. And Snow Falling on Cedars is the only one in that list that would make less money at the box office than Magnolia. By the time Magnolia's total was tallied up, in the US it had done 22.4 million worth of business. In overseas, 25.9, just fell short of 50 million at the box office, and New Line Cinema lost money off the back of it. To its disappointment as well, a huge Oscar run didn't happen. That it got 3 Academy Award nominations, one for Tom Cruise for Best Supporting Actor, one for Paul Thomas Anderson's screenplay, and one for Amy Mann's Best Original Song. This was the year that American Beauty lost lots and lots of Oscars, and Magnolia just came home at the end of them with nothing. A couple of things, though. There was, because this is a film whose reputation just continues to be high, I would suggest. That it's worth noting, Tom Cruise had a profits deal, back-end profits deal built into his contract. However, the film didn't break profit, so he got his $7 million for his 3 weeks' work and had to settle for that. And obviously, our heart goes out to him for that. But he was asked at the point where he was promoting it. I thought this was really interesting. Someone said to him, "How come you haven't played a character like this before?" And Cruise said at that point, "Please tell me in the last 15 years where this character has been." And he said, "Paul Thomas Anderson was barely born when I was making Top Gun." And this is true, although I would suggest it's Cruise hasn't really gone anywhere near a character anywhere near as daring since, apart from perhaps Tropic Thunder is about the closest that he's come. Anderson has given several interviews, as I said, where he talks about how he would do Magnolia differently, but it is the film of a daring late 20-year-old who could get anything made, and I would suggest Julie did. It's also the last film that he would make for New Line. He'd make his next film, Punch Drunk Love, for Sony. There Will Be Blood would turn up at Paramount and Miramax. The Master would turn up at Weinstein Company. Inherent Vice at Warner Brothers. Phantom Thread at Focus Features and Universal. And his latest, Licorice Pizza, at MGM. And he's dotted around a few studios there, but he's continued doing films very much in his voice. For me, as an Anderson fan, it's Boogie Nights and Magnolia, that incredible 1-2 double punch that remains a high point. I've not seen anyone attempt anything close to those two since. I think they're very, very special films. I will come back to Boogie Nights. Magnolia, though, as much as it divided people then, as much as it divided people now, I can honestly say I've seen nothing quite like it since. Which brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, just a few parish notices here that I can just annoy you with. If you enjoy this podcast, it's an independent podcast and your support is hugely appreciated. And in fact, it's your support that's got it this far. I'm at patreon.com/Simon Brew. If you can contribute to the podcast and help us with the running of it and the website and giving opportunities to new writers. If you sign up there and contribute a little bit of money to our coffers, you get the podcast early, you find out the latest gossip of what we're up to there, and the money is reinvested into helping bring more writers through, which is something I'm hugely passionate about. If I could ask too that you subscribe to the podcast, that hugely helps with posh algorithms that I don't understand, and ideally leave a hugely positive review as well. That's all much appreciated. But that's as many parish notices that I'm going to do this week, because I want to get on with the second of the two films that I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. Now, one of the things that Q&A that Paul Thomas Anderson did that I talked about was he talked about his love of Adam Sandler movies and of those kind of comedies. And so I thought I'll dig back into the archives and I'll find a very traditional Hollywood comedy to pair Magnolia with. So let's go back to 1984 and the start of, let's just say, a bit of a franchise. Here's a clip.
Crime. The city was full of it.
Hey! Free TV!
Desperate measures were needed.
Want you to go to the police academy.
The police academy is such a dangerous place.
Honey, don't worry.
Desperate measures were taken.
I'm joining the police force! Ah!
The mayor says we have to take this riffraff.
I'm trapped here?
Oh, yes. We all are.
What about guns? When do we get guns?
You will be schooled in firearms, police procedures, local laws, and many, many other things. High-speed driving. And self-defense.
I need a volunteer.
That's me!
I'd love it.
Police Academy.
Where did you get this gun?
Well, you'll be surprised to hear that's a clip from a film called Police Academy, dating back to 1984, directed by Hugh Wilson, with a script by Neil Israel, Pat Proft and Hugh Wilson, story by Israel and Proft. The cast for this one, led by Steve Guttenberg, Kim Cattrall, Bubba Smith, Donovan Scott, Michael Winslow, Andrew Rubin, David Graff, Marion Ramsey, G.W. Bailey, George Gaines, Leslie Easterbrook, just a few of the recruits in this particular film. And the Police Academy films have, there's no getting around it. They became the template for a while for the cheap Hollywood sequel, and several would follow in their path. But that original film, well, it dates back to an era where Hollywood was making lots of money off gross out comedies and off smutty comedies and crew the likes of Porky's and things like that were making huge profits at the box office. Now, producer Paul Maslansky was in the early 1980s was making a brilliant film that didn't do very well, but it's still a brilliant film called The Right right stuff. And Maslansky had made lots of films, none of which had hit. And he explained to the Los Angeles Times back in the 1980s that he was in San Francisco for location footage filming for the right stuff. And he said, I noticed a bunch of ludicrous looking police cadets being dressed down by a frustrated sergeant. And he said they were an unbelievable bunch, including a lady who must have weighed over 200 pounds, a man of well over 50. And he said, I asked the sergeant about them, and he explained that the mayor had ordered the department to accept a broad spectrum for the academy, for the local police academy. And so Maslansky started thinking, well, what if those cadets actually passed and made it to the police force? And he took that very simple idea to a man called Alan Ladd Jr. Now, I want to recommend a documentary to you here, a film called Laddie, which is the story of the late Alan Ladd Jr., who was famous, not infamous, for being one of the reasons the original Star Wars films got greenlit. But at this point, he had the Ladd Company set up, and you get that story in far more detail in the Laddie documentary, which is really, really good. And he liked the idea of setting up this film at his company, and he was hoping for something akin to, I don't know, National Lampoon's Animal House. That had gone great guns for Universal, for instance, and made a lot of money. And so Maslansky hired a couple of screenwriters. He got Neil Israel and Pat Proft to come up with the script. And what the pair identified was they didn't need to stray too far from the formula of how comedies were working. They told the Los Angeles Times that what they were looking for were 4 or 5 what they described as block comedy scenes to build the movie around. So 5 set pieces or 5 comedic setups. And then they could put a script together, as they duly did, that threaded those together. And that was their story. Nice and simple, but just with some comedy beats and comedy moments that they knew that they could bank on. There was a piece in May of 1983 that talks about how they were spending several weeks at the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department Training Academy as part of their research. But they got their script together, and in 1983, this was ready to go. Now, Maslansky was then looking for a director. And in fact, at first, he entertained a guy called Hugh Wilson as a possible writer on him. Now, Wilson hadn't directed a major motion picture, but he'd done work in Canada on a show WKRP, which had been successful and was very well respected. He'd written a film called Stroker Ace. But a Hollywood feature was new to him. And it'd be fair to say that the interview for the Police Academy director's job didn't go quite to plan, because he was sat in front of Maslansky, who said, have you seen Stripes? No. Porky's? No. Meatballs? No. Fast Times at Ridgemont High? No. Animal House? No. He was probably the only person in America of his age at that point who hadn't seen even one of them. The 5 touch points of the era that the Ladd Company was hoping Police Academy could tap into. But Maslansky was still impressed by him, and he put an offer in to him to direct. Now, Dom DeLuise was also in the running to direct this film, but he was committed to something else in the end, and so it opened up for Hugh Wilson anyway. And so Wilson, after having a bunch of films screened for him, he agreed, but he wanted control over the script. He wanted to be able to shape it, and he wanted to take the sleaze and the crude bits out. And so this led to quite a lot of going backwards and forwards, because Maslansky was fighting back over the amount of what was described as lowbrow comedy that Wilson was cutting out of the script. And he described to the Los Angeles Times, at one point, I told Hugh, let's keep some of the flatulence in. Always a good idea, that. And so Wilson responded to it, Paul, I'll put it in, I'll shoot it, but believe me, you won't want it when you see it. But there was a feeling that the script was getting a little bit further away from what the project was envisaged to be. And so there were disagreements over individual elements as the movie became less bawdy, really. And as Israel pointed out in the end, when Wilson and Maslansky turned in their, quote, sanitised rewrite of the script to the Ladd Company, the Ladd Company rejected it, and the film was nearly shelved at that point. And it was only when they went back and put in lots of the gags that Wilson and Maslansky had agreed to pull out, well, that was the moment where the Ladd Company decided actually it was back in again. Police Academy thus had its green light, but now they needed to basically attract an ensemble of cadets to work with in the movie. And it was in an Entertainment Weekly look back in 2015 that it was discovered the first choices for the role of Mahoney, if it is ostensibly the lead character in the movie, were Michael Keaton, Tom Hanks and Judge Reinhold. Bruce Willis auditioned for the role as well. Michael Keaton was said not to be available in the end, but he was very high up the list of choices. Bruce Willis wouldn't get it, but would audition for Moonlighting instead. Hanks talked about auditioning and then went off to audition for a film called Splash. But meanwhile, Steve Guttenberg, in his memoir, The Guttenberg Bible, just said that when he went in to read for the film, he just said he wanted it. He said, I read for Hugh Wilson. I knew this role. He said it was James Garner in The Great Escape. It was Bill Murray in Stripes. It was Humphrey Bogart in The African Queen. Well, maybe not to you, but that's what gave me some juice. And so he did his audition and Wilson said to him, thank you, that was good. And Guttenberg said, that's all I got. And I walked out. And he said the waiting room was filled with actors. And as I left, I saw a friend and he told me that the part had been offered to Michael Keaton. And so Guttenberg thought, well, that's it. Michael Keaton was in Night Shift, Ron Howard and Brian Grazer's hit movie. I can forget about it. So Guttenberg forgot about it and went to audition for, what do you know, a film called Splash. And I think you can probably work out how this turned out. That Guttenberg got a call back to do a full audition for Police Academy. His father was had roots in the police department as well, so he was able to take some of that background in. Hanks went off to audition for Splash, and as it turned out, Hanks would get one, Guttenberg would get the other. Now, the role of Commandant Lassard, well, that had Leslie Nielsen had been the template for that role, but it was Robert Conrad who was offered it and turned it down. In the end, it went to George Gaines. Elsewhere within the casting, well, G.W. Bailey at this point was known for playing Sergeant Rizzo on television's MASH, and in March of 1984, he was hired for his feature debut role as Captain Harris in the movie. I got a chance, meanwhile, to interview Michael Wilson a long time ago, who plays Jones, the human sound machine in the film, and he talked about how he came to the movie through shows that he'd done with the legendary musician Count Basie. And he says it was towards the end of the wonderful career that Count Basie did have, and he told me this. He said, I actually got the chance to be a part of it. And so he did this show with Count Basie, and he said, and the producer and director of Police Academy, they saw the show and roped me into the picture. And what had happened was he took the microphone and put it inside Count Basie's piano, and he said everyone had gone, the power had gone down for a while, and so he was basically doing his stuff. That the human sound effects just lit something up in Wilson and Maslansky's head, and so a role was written just a couple of months' notice specifically for him in the Police Academy films. Last through the door would be Bubba Smith, and so we've lost so many of the actors in the Police Academy movies. The late Bubba Smith, who'd come from a American football background as well, and all the while as these people were coming in, Wilson and his team kept working on the script. But by May of 1983, the film was ready to go before cameras. Now, it was going to shoot in Toronto. That the script at this point basically ran to what would be around 2.5 hours worth of material that Wilson would allow and encourage, especially given the comic talents he had, a fair amount of improvisation as well. But the shoot to Toronto, whilst it's commonplace now that a lot of American and certainly Hollywood movies shoot in Canada, it was fairly new that it was done for the reasons it was here at that point, because US films weren't really shooting in Canada at that point. However, the currency, the Canadian dollar, was very much in its favour. The tax laws were different, and the cost of physical crew was said to be 75% cheaper than making the film in Los Angeles. Now, in October of 1983, Screen International had reported that the original plan was to shoot the film in Florida, but it was the idea of production designer Trevor Williams to go and check the Toronto area out, and so they went and had a look, and in particular, one of the attractions was Lakeshore Psychiatric Hospital, a former facility that was just used for outpatients now at this point. It was on the shore of Lake Ontario, and what they liked about that is the facility was pretty much disused, and it afforded them places to sleep, it afforded them classrooms that they could shoot in, there was a parade ground, and they could basically build their police academy within that. They used a company called Special Missions Group to help with the weapons handling, to help with the fitness, the drills, and to get that side of things right. And so the film was up and running. But the pressure was soon on its debutante director, because Hugh Wilson, he would go on to direct things like Blast from the Past and Pleasantville. And again, we lost him a few years ago as well. But he was under real pressure on this movie, that there were rumours, and Guttenberg writes about this in his memoir, that he was going to be fired after the first couple of days of filming. But Wilson just kept his head down and kept going. And the Ladd Company in the end just stuck with him. Most of the cast and crew, they were staying together in the Toronto area. Steve Guttenberg, though, admits that he asked to be separated from them because he felt the character of Mahoney was such a loner that he wanted to spend a bit of time alone, and so that request was certainly granted. But Guttenberg also talks about how the test of a comedy director, in his words, is whether he can shoot a joke that becomes the scene that people use as the benchmark of the film. So this, I think this goes a little bit back to the blocks idea that Israel and Proft had based the film around. And I mean, Guttenberg says the scene that is described in concert with the story of the film, we were setting up for, I kid you not, the scene where G.W. Harris flies into a horse's ass. And he said, this was a Warner Brothers film, the studio that brought you Superman and made you believe that a man could fly. And they shot a sequence where they had to make an audience believe that a man could fly into the behind of a horse. Now, going back to that Michael Winslow interview that I did, I mean, he backs up Guttenberg in terms of praising Hugh Wilson on the filming of the movie. And he said, what Winslow told me was one of the things he said was the script is funny. This was the direction he gave to his actors. He said, the story's funny, so let the story be funny. So they shot the script and they got the script, but they afforded space in and around to do things like, well, Winslow ended up doing lots and lots of sound effects. Any sound effects you hear in the film, there's a sporting chance he was behind them, as well as some of the dialogue that he did. He also gave voices to the Gremlins in the Gremlins movies as well, but I'm sure I'll come back to that at some point. Now, in the midst of all of this, the release date was moving as well. It had been planned for a summer 1984 release, but there was a feeling that it's just going to get crowded out if it comes out in the middle of summer. So they moved it forward to the spring. Now, there's a gag right at the end of the film, don't think this is a massive spoiler, that involves a podium, it involves a lady, it involves a man, and it involves the man's trousers. I think that's the cleanest way I can possibly put it. Wasn't originally at the end of the film, though, that it was the suggestion of Alan Ladd Jr., who was watching the footage coming through. He just thought that is the perfect scene to end the film on, and so that is the reason you've got it at the end of the film. Nonetheless, the executives of the Ladd Company were still nervous about the movie, and as it headed into post-production, there was, going back to one of the Los Angeles Times reports, the one executive at the Ladd Company just said to Paul Maslansky, it doesn't fit the formula. It needs more flatulence, it needs more slobbishness, it needs more TNA. And there was a real feeling that the film needed to be grosser in order to succeed at the box office. That no matter that they got the film that they'd set out to make, there was still, that if you're going to make huge profits, you've just got to go gross or you've got to go bawdy. And Police Academy wasn't really doing either of those things. I mean, it had its moments, but certainly was far away from the extremes of where comedy was at that point, certainly mainstream Hollywood comedy. Warner Brothers nonetheless put $4 million behind the publicity of the film in the US. Given that it had cost $4.5 million to make, that was a substantive investment, really. The test audiences, though, had been positive to it, and I mean, in particular, characters such as Bubba Smith's Hightower, which led to him. I read somewhere that led to him elevating up the list of credits on the movie. But there was a feeling that the audience was enjoying it, and the audience was laughing at it. Now, critics certainly weren't laughing at it, that the movie's release was earmarked for March the 23rd, 1984, and when it went before critics, it got the response that you probably would have expected. That it's fairly infamous that Roger Ebert, for instance, the late Roger Ebert, gave the film a 0 score, and he just found nothing funny in it at all whatsoever. And Ebert didn't really give 0 scores out, and so when he did, it had to be a very, 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 very low bar. One or two critics were a little bit kinder to it, but there was no way this was going to be in the Oscar running, was it? However, those test screenings had gone well. And when the film opened up and went before audiences, it didn't take long for them to realise that they didn't just have a hit on their hands, they had an absolute flat-out sensation. And so, as the story, as Steve Guttenberg told the story, he said Warner Brothers can estimate the weekend grosses from the first few shows of a Friday. And he got a phone call from Paul Maslansky on that Friday, and he says, the film is going to take the weekend. It's going to be number one. Everyone from Warner Brothers is calling me. It's their smash hit. It's going to be an enormous money maker. And Maslansky, for instance, was a millionaire within days off the back of it. It opened that weekend in first place with a gross of $8.5 million, which in 1984, March of 1984, was an awful lot of money. In second place, ironically enough, was another hit movie, Splash, which had come out a few weeks before. The other films that were around at the time, well, Footloose was in 3, The Ice Pirates was there, Tank. I mean, against all odds. The other new release was a film called Racing with the Moon, which I hadn't heard of really until I came to look at this podcast. The rest of the top 10 was rounded out by things like Children of the Corn, Terms of Endearment, Blame It on Rio. But Police Academy was the sensation, and it was the era where if you had a hit movie, it could hang around for a very, very, very long time in cinemas. It would be nearly a month before a Friday the 13th film finally knocked it off the top of the chart, and then it went back up on its 5th week. It had 3 weeks at number 1, went down to number 2, back up to number 1 again, and it stayed there for another couple of weeks. And by the time Police Academy had completed its long run in US cinemas, it had grossed, 81 million in America alone. It was insanely profitable. And overseas, it was profitable as well. It was that rare Hollywood comedy that travelled effortlessly around the world. But then the money kept rolling in and rolling in and rolling in. A $10 million deal was inked to sell the film to cable television in America. Well, that covered the budget and the promotions budget as well, all in one swoop. Then the film was put out on VHS, video resale, and fans were able to buy a copy of the film for $80. So get this, whatever you think of Police Academy films, 100,000 copies of the film were sold at $80 a piece in 1 month. It got to the point that by January 1985, so what's that, 10 months after the release of Police Academy 2 was already in post-production, and Police Academy 3 had already been greenlit, and the series was ongoing from there. That we got the Police Academy 4 in 1987, Police Academy 5 in 1988, Police Academy 6 in 1989, then a bit of a jump to the 7th film, which I've covered previously for all sorts of reasons, not least an uprising in Russia. That's a story and a half. But the Police Academy films, whilst they were absolutely derided for the feeling that they were just photocopying the same jokes over and over and over again, were just regular moneymakers for a very long time. Maslansky tried a Ski Patrol spin-off as well at one point. And I think if you look at more modern Hollywood comedies, such as like The Hangover or something like that, it's following a not dissimilar template. It's just, let's just rework the same jokes and the same characters. It's just it's Police Academy that always got lambasted for him. The one thing I'd say on Police Academy as well is there was always the argument that the sequels were terrible and the first film was great. And I don't buy that. I don't think the first film is particularly good, really. I certainly don't think it stacks up too well today. If I had to pick one of them, I think the third one actually is far more fun than the first. I think the characters are far more established and they have a lot more fun with them. Plus, I could watch Michael Winslow and David Graff and people like that just doing their stuff over and over and over again quite happily, which is useful because that's what the Police Academy films tend to offer you. The films were an absolute sensation. And as snobbishly as they look now, they've made over $500 million at the global box office. They still sell on disc, and there are still plans to do an 8th movie at some point in the future. Where those plans are, I couldn't tell you. But for now, Police Academy made a lot of people very, very rich, and also became hugely influential, not necessarily for reasons we all like, in the way that Hollywood approached comedies and, more to the point, comedy sequels. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. Thank you, as always, for listening. If you're not tired enough of my waffle, I'm on Twitter at Simon Brew. I'm on the Film Stories Project is on Twitter at Film Stories Pod. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline and YouTube at youtube.com/filmstories. Also, a couple of other bits and bobs. I'm back live in Birmingham for the Christmas edition of my Movie Geek live show on December the 22nd, 2020. 2021 at the Midlands Arts Centre in Birmingham. You can find ticket details for that at the Film Stories website. That's filmstories.co.uk. That's also the website where every weekday we give you a whole load of movie news, reviews, mayhem, all sorts of bits and bobs there. And you can get all of our Film Stories magazines at store.filmstories.co.uk, which is also where you can find our Sneakers Blu-ray too. And that's that. And so I leave you in peace. I thank you as always for listening. I thank you for your time. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, you will please look after yourselves and stay safe. I'll be back soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Let's go,